Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar titled White Supremacy Culture, a conversation with Dr. Tema Okun. My name is Chelsie Burchett, and I am a PhD student studying social and health psychology at Stony Brook University and the Diversity Officer for SPSSI Graduate Student Committee. My research focuses on the intersecting identities and experiences of women of color in academia and their chosen career pathways.
And my name is Tina Lee. I'm the chair of the Graduate Student Committee and a PhD candidate at Teachers College, Columbia University. I study the psychology of racism and anti-racism in white communities. And I've also had a longstanding interest in white supremacy culture in various academic and activist spaces.
Hey everyone, and my name is Sammy Sachs. I am a recent master's graduate in the psychology department at Teachers College, which is how I know Tina. And I've also been organizing with the New York City chapter of SURJ, which stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is an organization that mobilizes white people into multiracial movements for justice for about 6 years, through which I've been involved in mostly local grassroots organizing efforts, especially around issues of policing.
Our main speaker today is Dr. Tema Okun. And Dr. Okun has spent over 30 years working with and for organizations, schools, and community-based institutions as a trainer, facilitator, and coach focused on issues of racial justice and equity. Tema currently co-leads the Teaching for Equity Fellows program at Duke University, which works with faculty seeking to develop stronger skills, both teaching about race and racism and across lines of race, class, and gender. She was a member of the educational leadership faculty at National Louis University in Chicago and has taught undergraduate, master's, and doctoral level students in educational leadership and education. Tema is the author of the award-winning book, The Emperor Has No Clothes, Teaching About Race and Racism to People Who Don't Want to Know, and the widely used article, White Supremacy Culture. Tema is a participant in the Living School for Action and Contemplation and a member of the Bhumiswara Sangha under the leadership of Lama Rod Owens. She is also an artist, a poet, and a writer. Her current projects include deepening her ability to love her neighbor as herself. She is finding the instruction easy and the follow-through challenging, given how we live in a culture that is afraid to help us do either or both.
Great, thank you so much, Chelsie. So today our agenda will include 30 minutes of conversation and dialogue with Tema and the moderators. Then we'll do a live Q&A portion with the audience for the second half. Please feel free to submit your questions during the first half by dropping them into the chat. We will also ask questions submitted in advance of today. Unfortunately, we can't answer every question as there were so many. So thank you for your contribution if you did submit one. So as an opening, Tema, can you briefly define white supremacy culture and what led to its conceptual framework? And before we begin, we also want to acknowledge that this is one way of understanding white supremacy culture, not the only way. It's a framework meant to contribute to a larger understanding of anti-racist work and the racial justice movement.
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. And okay, what do I want to say about white supremacy culture? Well, I'll say first, sort of how I understand it now and then how I came to it. So I'll start in the present and go back. So how I understand white supremacy culture now as a cultural project of disconnect. And its whole purpose is to disconnect through fear, using fear to disconnect and to disconnect people across lines of race, within racial groups, to disconnect us from each other and from ourselves, to disconnect us from God, spirit, divine, if we believe in that kind of thing, creativity, science, if we believe in that. It's a project of disconnect in service of the power elite who are hoarding power and profit. So its whole purpose, it's wed to capitalism. So its whole purpose is to disconnect us in service of those who are hoarding power and profit. And it's very clever. It's very ingenious. It's a way of creating. When we talk about culture, we're talking about traditions and values and beliefs and standards and norms. And so what it does is it makes normal things that are absolutely absurd. And, you know, we can point to any number of things, but the virulent racism in our culture that we see on exhibit now in our national landscape is acceptable because of white supremacy culture. The number of people who go to bed hungry every night is acceptable because of white supremacy culture. It makes things acceptable that if we were in our right minds, we would never, and hearts, we would never accept them. And it justifies the unjustifiable. If we know anything about our history, that's been its purpose, is to encourage people, and particularly white people, into justifications of things that can't possibly be justified. And I could point to any number of things in our history: the Carlisle Indian School, the court cases that reified whiteness as a race, the Tulsa. The examples are innumerable. And what I'll say is that how I came to understand it in this way started because I was in colleagueship, or I was working with really, really brilliant people who had been doing anti-racist work for a long time. And one of the most important mentors in my life is a man named Kenneth Jones, who died way too soon in 2004. So he and I were doing a lot of work together. We created some pretty deep anti-racist curriculum, and we were working with groups. When the article was written, when I first wrote the article in the late 90s, we were working on the West Coast. I was participating in the challenging white supremacy workshops that were led by another mentor, a woman named Sharon Martinez, in the Bay Area. And I had just gone to another of many, many workshops that I would go to, sponsored by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And if people don't know them, you should. They are sort of the grandmother, grandfather of anti-racist work for our longer generation and movement. And I was learning so much from all these different influences. And then I went to a meeting. I don't actually remember the meeting. I just remember that I came home and I was so frustrated by all the dynamics that I saw going on in the meeting. And I sat in front of my computer, and the bones of the article came through my body onto the page. So this was not a researched piece. This was not something that I sat down and studied about for a long time. It was something that came through me. So in that way, I don't feel like I own it, and also feel like that's why it's important to say what you said, which is this is one way of understanding white supremacy culture. And then I started, Kenneth and I just put it in our workbook. I had no notion of it circulating beyond that. The internet was just getting started, and people started putting the workbook on the internet without our knowledge. And then I showed it to Sharon, and Sharon said, you can't just talk about the characteristics without offering antidotes. So the reason there are antidotes are because of her. And then Daniel Buford, who was one of the trainers at the People's Institute, and I had a conversation, and he asked for credit for the pieces that he felt he influenced, which I was happy to give. And so that's how the article started. And then once it got on the internet, people started using it in lots of different and creative ways, which I found thrilling. And we're adapting it and making it work for their particular fields. We kept working with it at Change Work when Kenneth was alive. And then after he died, our collaborative became Dismantling Racism Works. We kept working with it. And it had some steady use. And then, like many things, when George Floyd was murdered, it experienced this deep resurgence. And at that time, I realized it had been so long since it had been written, I needed to really revise it, which is why I created the website as a revision to add the whole notion of fear, to do more nuanced explanations, to add a class lens, and to encourage people to ask people to not use the list as a weapon to shame and blame each other, but to use it as a doorway to understand how this culture, these cultural characteristics don't serve any of us, to get in our way. And our job here is to try and figure out a way to be in relationship with each other in ways that allow us to thrive, rather than in this kind of competitive, fear-based way. So I think that's what I have to say about that. And I was actually wondering, so I wanted to actually turn the question over to the three of you and to ask you how you understand it, or how you have been influenced by, or how it has showed up for you, to give some life to it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that thorough and excellent explanation of white supremacy culture and its origins. And As a Black student who has only experienced academia in predominantly white institutions, I've witnessed a revolving door of BIPOC students and faculty leaving the academy. Often it's due to lack of support or sense of belonging or their perceptions of diversity. And research, including my own, has shown that the majority of BIPOC individuals, when given a choice, often choose to leave academia for many reasons, but often because of those that I've just stated, but also they don't feel that academia truly supports them and that they would thrive in other healthier environments that are not steeped in white supremacy culture. I guess my question for you then is, why should institutions change how they operate? What has worked for them for so long? And what are the incentives in them doing so? And how can we escape this revolving door of BIPOC leaving academia?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer all of those questions. What I want to say, though, is they're such good questions. And I think the thing I want to say is that I encourage us to really interrogate what we mean by success. Because I would argue that if we look around in our world, that we are really struggling. We are really struggling in every possible way. We're struggling environmentally, we're struggling economically, we're struggling socially, we're struggling in every way. And I would venture to say that academia is not doing the job I think it should do, which is to help us collaborate in what we're going to do about these struggles, right? It's still very narrow. Success in academia is still very narrowly defined, in my view, as come to college, get a good degree, get a good job, get a big house, go shopping. I mean, it's a very, I think we really aren't, unless we're extraordinary educators, and there are many extraordinary educators. So I work at Duke, and what I would say is that the power of the work I do at Duke is that has very little to do with me and more to do with faculty who really care about their students and really care about the connection of the students to each other and then to the world that we're living in, and are so isolated and have so little support that the classrooms that we create become spaces where they can actually find others like them, like themselves, and be transgressive in being in community with other people who care about what they care about. So I think academia, if you look at the characteristics of white supremacy culture, my colleague at the time, Bree Carlson, and I were doing a workshop for the National Lawyers Guild, which is a progressive lawyers guild. And we went through all the characteristics and put them in small groups. And the small groups reported back, these characteristics are what law school wants us to be, requires us to be. It's the very definition of professionalism. So I think that academia has a lot of work to do to really ask itself, what are we really about? Because if we were really about curing the world, healing the world, if we were really about trying to build strong, thoughtful citizens, leaders, people, then we would be much more invested in helping every single person who comes here to thrive. And that's not how academia works. And academia is very competitive. It can be one of the cruelest places I've ever spent time in terms of how people feel they have to treat each other in order to get ahead. So to me, it's about interrogating what is it that we're really doing here, and how can I find my people in academia, and together, because this is an organizing principle that we have, one of our racial equity principles, find our people and organize together to create the spaces that are desperately needed. And that I find when those spaces are created, people are flock to them, because that's what most of us want. Most of us I don't actually think the traditional academic culture is good for anyone. And even the people who succeed in it, those of us in white bodies who succeed in it, I think succeed at a pretty high price for distancing ourselves from ourselves, because that's often what success in academia requires.
Yeah, I feel like what you said, Tema, is so powerful, that disconnection, not only, you know, with society and institutions, but also like with each other and our relationships with each other. And how does academia sort of like disconnect us even more from the communities that we want to serve and work with? And in line with Chelsea's question, I often find that I have to advocate for myself and my community as an Asian American student. And spaces that center whiteness and often marginalized communities of color, some students have the privilege of just being students, while others are placed in a position of representing and advocating for their communities all the time. That said, what do you think is the role of white allies in addressing these differential power dynamics? And how can they help advocates of color navigate white spaces without dominating or recentering their own whiteness?
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk about a lot when people invite me to talk is encouraging people and encouraging white people who are often much less clear about this, to encourage us, all of us, to be really clear about our stake in racial justice. And again, for those of us who live in white bodies, to be really clear that that stake is not about helping others, and it's not about lifting people into whiteness, which a lot of us are confused about. It's not about being gatekeepers into whiteness. It's about, can we identify why racial justice is in our direct interest? Because, and this can be a subtle point, although it's becoming less and less subtle to me. Belonging to whiteness is not good for me. I don't think it's good for anybody. There's nothing about these characteristics that I list in the work that I've done that I think are helpful or good. I think they're toxic. I think whiteness is toxic. And if those of us who are white can find other white people, work in affinity groups to find other white people to really talk about, okay, what is the price that I'm paying to belong to whiteness unconsciously? And how can I bring consciousness to that? And then how can I start with you, with others, to transgress that, both within the white affinity group, and then creating solidarity with communities and people of color in ways that don't center us and don't assume that our job is to help people assimilate into whiteness. Because the challenge, I think, white supremacy is so clever. I mean, it's one of the things I admire about it. It's very clever, it's very adaptable, it's very ingenious. It builds in its own defenses. So, you know, one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture is denial and defensiveness. Like, I don't want to even talk about white supremacy culture, because if I do, then what's going to happen is I'm going to find out that I'm bad. And an interesting dynamic about how white supremacy culture works on those of us living in white bodies is it encourages us to think that we're better just because we're white, while at the same time encouraging us to hate ourselves. It's so devious. It's so amazing how devious it is. So I think there's this understanding that some of us have who are full of dis-ease about belonging to whiteness, that underneath it all, this is not actually serving us. Maybe there's some material benefits to belonging to the white group. I mean, not maybe, there are material benefits for many white people, not all white people belonging to the white group. And those material benefits come at such a high cost that in the end, it's not really worth it. And we know it's not really worth it because we're killing our planet in every single way that I can think of. So, you know, and we're killing our planet because of this marriage between white supremacy culture and capitalism, and this idea that we can, that you know, it's okay to have a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk. It's okay for people to own more capital, more money than whole nation states. You know, that's absurd. It's absurd. It's completely absurd that's our reality. And so I think part of the work that those of us in the white group have to do is to become very, very clear about our direct stake in racial justice and to embody that. Because once that happens, then our ability to be in solidarity with you comes from our desire to be free, not from any patronizing or helping mode. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Tema. That definitely resonates a lot with me. And yeah, that framing and the article and the whole framework of white supremacy culture characteristics has definitely been very formative for me in my own process of deepening into anti-racist practice and all of my unlearning and shifting my life in that direction in general. And you spoke to this before, but I really find the framework helpful because instead of calling something or trying to think of something known as like white culture, as if that were a concept that relates to other types of cultures, which is just this very slippery, problematic, and ultimately empty thing, like you've spoken to it, calling it white supremacy culture highlights how whiteness is actually a system of supremacy. It's actually a system of resource and power hoarding. And that it's actually not, it's a culture in the way we're talking about, but not to be compared to others. So yeah, I really appreciate that. And just to build from where you're talking, in my experience of working to resist and dismantle white supremacy and white supremacy culture, how I can as a white person, I have noticed roles in kind of two broad categories. One being like a resourcing of myself through collective practices, individual practices, to be able to be more ready to be responsive in a given moment, as in when something racist is said or done or being discussed, to be prepared to like be ready to actually be responsive. And then also the second being more like connecting into active work and being proactive and seeking out ways to shift structures and to take part in collective action and doing what needs to be done to change the system as it currently is. So I'm curious how you see the characteristics playing out in those two domains, especially the active one, because I think the responsive one feels a little bit more clear to me, but curious what you think about any of that.
Well, I don't know. Again, when you speak, you all make me think of stories. So I'm going to answer with a story. I hope that's okay. And the story happened today. So I was witness, I wasn't there, but I was part of the debrief conversation today with some brilliant facilitators that I'm privileged to be in community with. And they had just facilitated a meeting where the only person of color, the only Black woman in the 4-person group, said to one of her white colleagues that that colleague was consistently undermining her leadership. And the white colleague responded with silence and then responded with, well, I know I'm the problem, and then started crying. So what I notice about the way that white supremacy culture shows up again, I think I know white supremacy culture impacts all of us regardless of our racial identities. So now I'm talking about the way it impacts those of us who are white. It is that it builds in this way in which those of us who are white take everything completely personally and make it about us. And as soon as we make it about us, then we are caught and we cannot be in relationship across lines of race and often with other white people, because our whole being becomes so full of fear that all we can do is defend against the idea that we might be in some way colluding or collaborating with racism. And our whole being becomes a defense mechanism against that very thought. And you have just said something to me, and all I'm hearing is that you think I'm a terrible person, I'm not worth anything, and I can't even begin to handle it. And so I'm going to be defensive, and I'm going to make it about me, and I'm going to start crying, which is going to be manipulative, and then you're going to have to console me in some kind of way. And then the dynamic goes on, right? So the simple thing that any of us who are in white bodies can do in a situation when someone accuses us of participating in racism is to say, give me a minute, take a breath. Okay, tell me more. Tell me more. Because once we are actually able to hear how we are participating in racism, we have a chance of becoming free. As long as we defend against understanding how it is that we collude, and this is true, everybody colludes, for all of us, if we defend against the idea that we collude, because white supremacy makes it impossible for us not to collude if we want to feed our families, get a degree, do all the things that we have to do. If we don't understand that, oh, I'm colluding now. oh, I'm making this decision, and it's not the decision I want to make, but I'm weighing this against that. Oh, I'm in community with other people who are going to help me figure out how to navigate this terrible decision. We have no chance for actually being free, for actually being liberated from white supremacy culture, because we're so caught up in, this is about me personally, this is about me being a bad person, and I'm just going to completely shut down. And, you know, it's so a big piece of it, I think, whether proactive or responsive, is to understand that we are a collective body, we are interdependent, we need each other desperately in order to thrive. And if we are going to be in community with each other and help each other to thrive, then we have to learn to be honest with each other in ways that are that open possibility. So I'm not talking about certainly not talking about honesty through violence or honesty through you know, a culture of critique that's just all about telling everybody what's wrong with us. I am talking about, it's like if somebody says to me, you know, you've been undermining my leadership. It's not something I want to hear. I don't want to be somebody who's undermining someone's leadership. But until I can hear how I'm doing that, then I have no chance of changing. And that somebody would say that to me is such a gift. It's such a gift, because what could be happening, and I think has happened many times in my life, is that people have just written me off. It's like, it's not even worth saying anything to her because she's not going to change. So, you know, it's how can we be in community with each other and understand that racism and white supremacy are going to permeating the very air that we breathe. And so I'm not going to take it personally. I'm going to act out of my racist conditioning. I am going to do that. And I can never promise you that I won't. But I can promise you that if I can't catch it myself, if you catch it for me, I'll listen and I will learn and I will grow, because that's what I want. I want to listen and learn and grow. I'm not saying this is easy. None of this is easy. That's, again, part of the design of white supremacy culture, is to make it hard. It's so much easier to hate each other and to say, you know, you're messed up and, you know, never want to work with you again. And we have to draw boundaries. I'm not saying we don't have to draw boundaries. We have to respect what people are capable of. And then we have to find the people who are capable of what we need people to be capable of.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that, Tina. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to like resonate with what you said in terms of like white supremacy culture affects all of us, not just white people. And I know as an Asian American that I'm constantly by default positioned closer to whiteness and further away from Blackness. And I have to be like conscious of that all the time. And because the incentives are there to like subscribe to white supremacy culture and to like align myself with that. Right. And related to that, I think we have a follow-up question from an audience member. Sammy?
Yeah. So I'm going to combine a few. I think maybe also related to Gabe's question also. So Tema, you've just been speaking to this a bit, but just in general, like I think there are questions around, you've definitely just given a few really wonderfully tangible examples, but there's a question of like, what are the tangible tools to resist and change white supremacy culture in different spaces? There are also, I'm just going to combine a few just since we're short on time. And like speaking to what Tina was just raising, you know, someone asked prior, does white supremacy culture manifest in racial or ethnic communities? How does unlearning white supremacy culture differ in BIPOC communities versus white communities? And I think Gabe's question, I haven't been able to give it a full read, I'm sorry, but let's just start there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those are kind of, they're related, but also I'm going to start with the first one. So if you visit the website, there's one page called Racial Equity Principles. And I want to say that there are 10 of them. And I believe in those principles deeply. And those principles come from collaborative work with colleagues over more than a decade of working with communities and organizations to live into their racial equity commitment. And we finally sat down as a collaborative and said, okay, after all this time, what do we know works? And those principles came out of that long conversation and sort of digging into what we had learned after all that time. And I will say quite humbly that I use one of these principles every day. I think they're really effective. They're not the answer. Again, I'm not a proponent of the anything. They are a way of thinking about things, and they include things, one I've named. So this idea of organizing mind and finding your people and building your influence, and sharing what Sharon Martinez says, each one reach one, teach one. So if we have 4 people, each one reach one, then we become 8, then we become 16, then we become, and so that the idea is that we're starting with like-minded people, and like-minded just meaning people who have the same commitment and the same desire for the change, and or for healing, and or for support, whatever it is that we're trying to do around racial equity. And so that's one. Thinking and acting collaboratively is another one. Choosing connection over fear is another one. So there are 10 of them, and I think that we have found them when I use them personally, and then when I use them in a group as we're trying to think about how to tackle something, how do these principles apply? I hope that those will be a useful tool for you. And we come out of so many movements that have taught us so much. And one of the things I notice is, I was I'm old enough and lucky enough to have grown up during the 60s, during the anti-Vietnam War movement, the movement organizing against AIDS, or organizing for support around AIDS, the LGBTQ+ movement, the women's movement, all of these movements having their own issues and problems, and racism being infused with racism, and helping me to really live in spaces where people were using organizing mind. And I feel like one of the challenges that those of you who are younger have is that there have been movements during your lifetime, but they're not as embedded in the culture as they were when I was coming up. And so what I've seen is that sometimes people don't understand how to collectively work towards power. So people will try and come in and save the day individually, and take too much of a risk and get isolated that way, or they'll come together. They'll be confused about what the power is for, because they haven't yet figured out this sort of collective idea, and what does it mean to think about what's in the best interest of the collective, not just what's in the best interest of those of us in the group. One of the principles is to build and honor power with and for and in the margins, because if we are organizing with people who've been pushed to the margins, then all of us are going to be served. And if we're just working for a specific group, then that's not on the margins, then the margins are going to be left out again. So I would really recommend looking at those. And I think that we believe deeply in the power of affinity groups, because the work that white people have to do is different than the work that BIPOC people have to do, and the healing and the study and the and if we do good work in affinity groups, then our ability to work together is so much stronger. And I think in every community, white communities, communities of color, the white supremacy is just like beckoning, like even if you can't be white, try your best to assimilate into whiteness, try your best to fit in, try your best to we'll give you some power, we'll give you some credibility if you just sacrifice, if you just cut off your left arm. Oh, no, now cut off your right arm. Oh, now cut off your toes. When I was in my doctoral program at UNC Greensboro, I had the great privilege of being in community with another graduate student named Rydell Harrison, who was and is African-American, gay divinity student, male identified student, who talked about how, as he was encouraged to move up the ladder, he was also told that he had to strip every piece of his identity until all he had left was his socks. So I think that's the, and again, the key is, am I aware that that is what's being asked of me, or am I so bought in that I think that's what I'm actually supposed to do? And that can be the key. It's like, what's the awareness that I'm bringing to the stripping process? And am I making deliberative decisions and weighing the risks and costs, given all the things that I'm responsible for, or am I just going along because I'm not even questioning that this is what's being asked of me? It's, and it's why we see such high rates of suicide, homicide, drug addiction, depression, mental illness, is because we're living in a culture that just tells us we have to divide ourselves from ourselves. We have to abandon ourselves. And I think that's true across racial groups. It just shows up differently.
Well, thank you for that, Tema. I mean, I think Gabe's question kind of segues nicely for just specifically what minoritized groups need to do or can do. So specifically, Gabe's question is, how does one make change, specifically a minoritized group, to make change in white supremacy culture in academia, such as PWIs, when previous attempts have invalidated and targeted us, leaving minoritized groups even more subjugated, thus reinforcing white supremacy culture and leaving the minority even more discouraged and ostracized?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I had an easy answer for it. My answer is, again, find your people and organize your people and call on the resources that are available from people who have done organizing before. You don't have to recreate the wheel here. There are incredible resources, strategy charts, ways to think about it. And part of it is engaging in a weighing of the risks that you're taking, an agreement in any group that you're willing to take the risks, and then a conversation about what you're going to do if it goes badly. How are you going to help each other? How are you going to support each other? Because even if an institution responds harshly and punitively, if you're together with your people, you can at least understand that as institutional retribution, not as something wrong with you. Right? You can again not take it personally. You can understand this is the way institutions work because you are powerful enough that you're threatening the way they do business and making them uncomfortable enough. So part of it is, the most powerful thing I've seen, and this is both BIPOC groups and white groups, is when groups of people start making decisions on their own about what's good for us. So, and here's a very small example. When I was in my doctoral program, you have these doctoral committees that you have to put together, and they're supposed to approve your work. Well, I and several other students, we created our own doctoral committee. We had the official committee that we had to have. And then each of us had brought in people that loved us, cared about us, understood what we were trying to do, gave us advice. I had 36 different people read my dissertation and give me feedback, not the whole thing, but different chapters. And so that regardless of how the institution responded to it, I knew how the people I cared about were responding to it. And that's where I put my attention. I was lucky though. I was in an education department that actually supported the work that I was doing. So I was very lucky. That's not always the case. And so again, over and over and over again, I can just tell you to find your people so that you're not isolated, and your people can help you to understand that when the institution tries to isolate you, it doesn't mean you are isolated. It just means you're powerful. And you can develop strategies for how to take care of each other. Because that's what we need to do. We need to take care of each other because institutions are going to come after us.
And a question that is a little bit related to that, I think you answered indirectly before, but an audience member asked it again. I think it would be useful to discuss it. How would you understand committing to racial equity as good for me as a white person compared to centering whiteness?
Well, I think that centering whiteness just means whenever we're doing something and we're centering white concerns, white feelings, white ways of doing things. So if I'm clear as a white person that my stake in racial justice is to do things differently than the way I'm comfortable with, or to try something new, or to feel how uncomfortable I am about the thing that's being suggested, and to go, I'm in anyway. Like to really let go of my one right way thinking, to really understand that I have a lot to learn about what it means to really collaborate, then I'm not gonna be centering whiteness in the same way. It's like, that's why I think it's so clear for me to understand what my stake in racial justice is, that I have so many stories I could tell you about thinking I knew the right way to do something and thinking I was qualified to do something I was not the least bit qualified to do, and acting on that sense that I was qualified or that I knew the right way, and how much trouble I got into, both literally and then trouble in terms of my relationships and trouble in terms of what the end result was. And then stories about where I actually let that go and went, oh, okay, I don't really understand how this is going to work, and I'm going to open to it anyway. And then seeing how things unfolded in ways I couldn't possibly have predicted or known, because I was so closed to thinking about, so close to it, or not even able to imagine it. And sort of like getting out of our own way, I think decenters whiteness. It's like, can I see the possibility in ways of doing things or in ways of showing up that I had not even considered, because I was so full of fear and so focused on defending myself as one of the good white people. So again, my answer at this point for all of us who are white is to get really, really clear about our stake in racial justice, both individually and collectively, and to look around and see how doing things the white way has not got us anywhere good.
Yeah, that resonates a lot, and it just makes me think about one aspect of that. Just one of the main SURJ values is, organizing out of mutual interest, and it's so deeply rooted in that, that constant like investigation and revealing of what that stake is. And I just wanted to go ahead, please. Yeah.
Other thing I want to say is that for me, my experience is that living into my commitment to racial equity, it's like magic. And I say that because when I understand how white supremacy and racism impact me and the way I think and my conditioning, and I start to work with that, it starts to open up everything. So my gender stuff, my class stuff, it's just such an opening. It makes so many things possible that weren't possible before, and brings a lot of happiness, actually. If I can get through the hard things, where I'm being challenged about how I'm showing up, in the end, it always brings more happiness, always. So it's selfish too.
Exactly. Thank you for adding that, for sure. I wanted to ask bubble up questions from Ranjana, who asked just kind of some more questions just about this construct of whiteness, asking like, why is white, as a color seen anyway as better in the minds of people? What about whiteness makes it worth emulating? Is it the power or money or what? Curious for your thoughts. And Ranjana also asked later, that belonging to whiteness, it's like it requires killing humility, and that it's hard to separate whiteness from meritocracy. It's like tied up in all these ideas. So curious if you could speak on any of those concepts.
Well, this is a history question, I think. So, I'm speaking about the United States, and I believe that the way white supremacy shows up here is being exported quickly all over the globe. And I want to be clear, I'm talking about in the US. And in the US, the term white started here, and it wasn't a term that was used. People came here from Europe by nationality, they were not white. And people from England and France, and sort of the folks who became the plantation owners, started to realize that they were outnumbered by indentured servants coming from Europe and people they were bringing here forcibly from Africa, some of who came as indentured servants in the beginning. And white indentured servants and African descent indentured servants were getting together and collaborating and running away and protesting and revolting, and not to mention all the challenges that the plantation owners and the colonists, the settlers were having, trying to displace indigenous people. So completely outnumbered numerically, and realized that what they needed to do was wipe out this idea of nationalities and organize all the people from Europe into a group called white. And the first time this shows up is before the term white is ever even used. It's in the 1640s or something. There's a case of a man named John Punch. So John Punch was an African-American man who ran away with a Dutchman and a Scotchman from a plantation or farmer named Hugh Gwynn, who was using them as indentured servants. They all ran away to Maryland. They were caught, they were brought back. Hugh Gwynn was known as a very sort of mean farmer. And what the court did, without even using the word white, was sentence John Punch to lifetime enslavement and sentence the Dutchman and the Scotchman to some limited amount of enslavement, and then they could be free. And I always invite people to imagine that court scene and what's happening for John Punch in that time, what's happening for the Dutchman and the Scotchman as the sentence comes down and it becomes really clear. This is the first time that whiteness as a legal privilege is noted. And then the word white comes into use in the Virginia House of Burgesses. So it was definitely an organizing term to organize people of different nationalities into a racialized group that would then understand itself as being separate and better and normal and American, in opposition to enslaved people and brought forcibly from Africa and indigenous people, and in order to help the numbers and to consolidate European people into this thing called white. And so material benefits started to be given, and then psychic benefits, then cultural benefits, and one of the first jobs that free white indentured servants could get was as on slave patrols, as foremen on plantations. So policing jobs, sort of the whole notion of policing Black and brown-bodied people as a well-paying job for white-bodied people. So it was built as a divide and conquer strategy to split people who had shared economic interests, to split them apart and invite people of European descent into this category called whiteness, and to start giving it benefits in consistent ways, and to position white people as normal and better, and to position Black and brown-bodied people as savage, criminal, lazy, although they were doing it's just, again, absurd, doing all the work, but to start to assign value based on this thing called race. So that's the history lesson answer for that. And then it just got embedded in our culture, which is why I call it white supremacy culture. It's the water that we're all swimming in, this idea that whiteness is both better and normal. And the final thing I'll say about that is that there's a wonderful sort of, what do you call those books that are a seminal book for me called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. And in that book, she describes something called aversive racism. And she's talking about the ways in which racism often shows up most when you have two candidates for a job that are equally qualified. Because what will happen when you have two equally qualified candidates, one white and one a person of color, the hiring committee, again, not necessarily just white people, the hiring committee is going to assume that the white person is just that much more qualified simply because they're white. And that this is the mindset so many of us are walking around with. And again, that's reflected in the studies that people do where they send resumes with Black sounding names and white sounding names. And so this is the air that we're breathing, the water that we're swimming in. And I don't have to wake up in the morning and go, oh, I'm going to be racist today. I'm going to wake up in the morning having imbibed or taken in this way of thinking. And if I am not made aware of it, then I'm going to act on it. And even if I am made aware of it, I still sometimes act on it. And, I'm having to undo that, and will have to undo that my whole life.
Thank you for that. As a follow-up question, or another question we have from the chat, we have Omar, who asked, thank you so much for this, or sorry, said, thank you so much for this talk, and then asked, I firmly believe that white guilt when talking about race and racism is a function of white supremacy culture, but how would you trace its origins? This process of disconnect is so important, and to put the idea of white guilt onto a higher level, beyond interpersonal interactions and individual experiences, how does white guilt operate or is produced at a structural or institutional level?
That's a great question. And I'm going to, oh gosh, I hope I can remember his name. I'm going to reference a newspaper writer whose name is escaping me. Many years ago, I read his article, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now. And he talked about white guilt. The African-American newspaper columnist talked about how he didn't want white people's guilt because white guilt inevitably turns into resentment. Like if I'm made to feel guilty about something, I'm going to resent that you're making me feel guilty, and that's what we're seeing in a lot of the politics of whiteness today. And so I'm going to reference this person whose name I should remember in a minute. And then I'm going to also reference a friend and colleague named Gita Gulati-Parti, who, when I was writing in my dissertation about guilt and talking about how it's not useful, she actually challenged me on that and said that she thinks that there are a lot of things that those of us who are white have to feel guilty about, and that's true. If we know our history at all and sit with that history, and again, it's a history of justification, of dehumanizing and violence that is inexcusable and not justifiable. And so to sit in that history and not feel guilty about belonging to the white group means I would not be human. And so I think guilt is a natural stage that those of us who are white become aware of as we become aware of what it means to be white in a racist culture, in a racist society. And what the gosh, I could remember his name. What the newspaper columnist was saying was that, and just don't get stuck there. Feel it, acknowledge it, and don't live from that place. Because if you live from that place, you're not going to be helpful to me or to anyone, because you're going to be so wound up in your guilt that it's not going to be useful to anyone. And it's going to turn into resentment. And I certainly don't want your resentment. So there's another article that doesn't have as much traction that I wrote at the same time, which I actually think has almost more to offer, which is called, what's it called? White Identity Development. And the Crossroads Institute and I have been working on an updated version of that, so that should come out soon. But it looks at white identity development, and guilt and shame is one of the stages that we inevitably have to go through as we start to understand ourselves as white people in a racist society. And again, the key here is to go through it, to feel it, to acknowledge it, to understand why it's, belonging to whiteness is not actually something to aspire to, and then to move on.
So this will be our last and final question. What is required to change policy in sustainable ways, in your opinion?
Okay. So again, I'm going to answer in my own way. I'm not sure it's a real answer to your question. So the framework that we use, and by we, I mean Change Work When Kenneth Was Alive and Dismantling Racism Works, is to talk about racism as in three expressions: that it's institutional, which has to do with policies and procedures and practices of institutions; that it's cultural, which has to do with the values and beliefs and standards and norms of any group of people; and that it's personal, interpersonal. And that these three are interweaving all the time. And when Kenneth and I first started working together, we spent a lot of time with communities and organizations working on changing their policies. So their written policies and practices, the laws that govern the way that they did business. And then eventually, after half a decade or so, came to understand that we could change what was written down, but that didn't actually mean anything if the culture didn't also shift. And I think about the civil rights movement as an example of this. So, people fought hard and long and well, and many people sacrificed their lives for a civil rights movement that was focused in large part on changing the laws so that there would be more equity. And we owe our ancestors and still living people everything for that. And what we can see today is that while significant progress was made, the underlying culture of our nation did not change. And so we're experiencing this, so that the beliefs about racism and about the cost of whiteness didn't really grab hold. And so the policies and procedures that were so hard fought for have been slowly but surely undone over time. And so I think, to me, it's a, so another racial equity principle is we need to work on all three levels. So if you're really good at policy change, then couple with people who are really working on culture shift, and then triple with people who are working on the personal work that all of us have to do so that our egos aren't leading, which is what happens when we have such terrible leaders. So policy change to me is about centering, inviting, talking with, being in relationship with people on the margins. An example of that is if you read and have read the Black Lives Matter platform, that platform is going to benefit me. And I'm a white-bodied, very privileged person economically in all kinds of ways. So that's how we know it's a really good policy platform, because when those things get enacted, everybody's going to benefit. So that's one thing to think about, making sure that you're in relationship with those pushed most to the margins as you're creating the policies. And then to think about what are the cultural and interpersonal, personal aspects that are required to shift as well.
And one of our audience members, Tara, just said something that fits perfectly what you just said. The ideology is passed on to new generations through structural racism and interpersonal racism unless it gets interrupted. It's also intentional and damaging.
Yeah.
And with that said, this wraps up our webinar for today, White Supremacy Culture, a conversation with Tema Okun. Thank you, Dr. Okun, for your time and investment with the three of us and our audience, and for providing wisdom on this topic. I think that there's still more to learn for all of us about white supremacy culture and the ways that it shapes our lives and our relations with institutions, communities, and each other.
Thank you for coming and spending an hour with us. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. And as a continuation of this topic, we hope you join us for the next webinar by our Graduate Student Committee taking place on May 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's titled The Roles of Power and Oppression in the Academic Community. We'll be discussing how we can engage in academia and grapple with experiences of oppression and inequity in our professional development.
And I'm just dropping some links for some key resources in the chat. That was just the link to the registration for the next webinar. I'm going to drop the link to the latest version. I did this at the beginning, but the Divorcing White Supremacy Culture website. Also, just in case, for anyone who's interested in SURJ as an organizing space where anti-racist work within white communities is the focus, here's a link to the national website for that. There's also individual chapters which you can Google around or look on social media for those specific groups. And finally, this is a link to the YouTube page where the recording of this talk will be posted in the next few days on SPSSI's channel. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.